now the podcast starts.
Hello, dear listener, and welcome to the podcast on which we talk about horror. Sometimes we talk about other things, and sometimes we do swear a little bit. I am your co-host, Dan, sometimes known as TD Velasquez. I'm a film writer and enthusiast, and I have the great pleasure of being joined by my co-host, Kirsty Warrow, the film teacher and lecturer and writer. How are you, Kirsty?
I'm good, thank you. How are you, Dan?
Better than I've been for ages. I think I know that you've had a bit of a cold recently.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm getting over one. So touch wood, though. Not that I'm superstitious, but touching wood very much, because whenever I think this cold has gone away, it always comes back. I hope that's not your experience too.
No, well, I feel like I'm at the back end of it, but yeah, I think this is sort of, the kind of as the winter comes in, there's kind of any significant changes in temperature, either up or down. I always kind of end up with a little bit of a sniffle, so that's okay. It's it's
Right.
just it's just part of living in Britain, isn't it? I think.
Yes, we're very much prey to the climate, and because I'm using a good mic in a different room to usual, the listener might be able to hear the heating system in my house. That's been very necessary recently. Not always affordable, but necessary, so I've
Yeah.
been using it as much and also as little as I can. I'm also wearing a cardigan that you can't hit. Well, maybe you can. I
So
tried to,
yeah, I do
tried to
wonder what the
rustle it,
listeners,
but
yeah, what the listeners
yeah.
think we wear based on our voices. I'm really interested.
Well, um, answers on a postcard, please, dear
Yeah.
listener. So, Kirsty, before we talk about the main topic of today's episode, as always, I would like to ask you, what is your favourite thing in horror today?
Today, I actually don't have a huge amount of favorite things in horror today, but my most recent new horror experience was I watched Megan with my daughter
Yeah,
earlier this week because
Mithrigan.
Mithrigan.
Yes.
There's always so with in our house we're big Key and Peele fans. I don't know if you've seen the kind of Key and
Oh
Peele
yes,
sketch
I
show,
love,
but
I
so
love
every
Key
time
and
we talk
Peele. Yeah.
about Megan, my husband always goes Megan, Megan. So that's all I can ever think
Right.
about is Jordan Peele brilliantly as the very high maintenance girlfriend Megan. Yeah, so
Ah, right.
I watched Megan Mithrigan.
Yes, I've seen it
My
too.
daughter. Yeah, because we were
Um,
both off poorly with the sniffles and so we decided to watch horror films in the middle of the day. And
Great.
I'm loving that this is the era that we're into now, with her. So we watched Megan, and I was I'm kind of interested in AI and kind of advances in technology and um yeah, I didn't. I that was it was an interesting idea, and I'm reading. Get the name of the author, Japanese author. I'm reading Clara and the Sun at the moment,
Oh, I
which is
don't know
about
that one.
artificial friends. So it just felt like a interesting, you know,
Okay.
yeah, kind of coming together of sort of different approaches to the same idea. But to say, as much as I love Blumhouse, I wasn't overly taken
I,
with the
I,
film.
I would agree with you. As we said in our discussion about androids and gynoids a while ago, I think
Yeah,
you and I both have a fascination with this kind of subject
yeah,
matter, and I don't think the movie really capitalizes on that, although it is fun and it has
yeah. Oh
some
no, yeah,
standout
yeah,
bits.
yeah.
Um,
I love the
I
sort
think
of dancing killing bit. That was fun.
Yes, it's a fun sequence, but like a few bits of the film, I was left thinking afterwards, so why did that just happen?
Yeah,
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 and also I
yeah.
think there are some pretty ropey performances in the movie, but not Alison Williams, who is the lead. I think
No,
she's very good in it. It's a good vehicle for her.
yeah,
Um, it's an enjoyable movie, and if they make Muthrigan 2 or Matugan or whatever it would be called, I'd be tempted to watch it. But
Yeah.
I get the impression that Blumhouse have reached a kind of churning stuff out point.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
haven't
I
seen
don't yeah.
the percentage of their output that I've seen is going down all the time. And it's a shame because in the moment of Get Out and Black Klansman and the Halloween revival and things like that, I was starting to really register Blumhouse on my radar and get excited. But now they just seem to have pumped out a load of films which I don't find really interesting.
No, it did feel like trying to. I mean, maybe that's it. Maybe it was trying to be, accessible horror for a slightly younger audience. I find it really interesting, and I know this maybe fits into plans that you've got for future episodes, but I find it really interesting watching with her, because my daughter really vocalizes her thought process of how she's, kind
Right.
of putting things together, and it's fascinating that even though she's not had a huge amount of exposure to horror cinema broadly in the way that which we think about it, she's really hyper aware of conventions, and so it was kind of it's always interesting with watching with her and watching kind of listening to how
Okay.
she's formulating her expectations about what's going to happen to particular characters, or so yeah. So it was interesting. So
Oh,
frog in my throat.
that's all right, Kirsty. It's an occupational hazard.
Oh, isn't it just? Yeah.
Uh,
So
but yes, I think we are in agreement that Megan is not great but fun
yeah.
and interesting.
Yeah.
Maybe not as interesting as it should be, but I think it's a recommendation. And also, our chat about androids kind of follows on those themes quite nicely. So I'll put a link in the show notes to our
Yeah.
previous episode where we talk about that stuff. I wonder if that was recorded before or after Muthrigan came out. I'm not sure.
Yeah. I don't know actually. Yeah.
But
I mean, I know it's been a film that I've been meaning to see for a while, so I'm glad that I finally got around to it.
yes, me too. All right, so let's move on to the film that we're going to be talking about today then. So, listener, obviously I imagine you will have read the name of the episode on your podcatcher, but maybe you haven't, maybe it just auto-played. But if you did see it, you'll have seen a title which you could be forgiven for thinking was denoting maybe a weird sequel to Alex Garland's Men that Kirsty and I and Ian discussed a while back. It is not. The title of the movie is Enys Men, which is Cornish for Stone Island. The movie came out in 2022, and before I describe the plot, which there isn't a great deal of, I'll talk a little bit about the movie. It's a low-budget British movie produced by Film 4 and written and directed and edited and shot and composed and produced by Mark Jenkin. If you have seen his previous movie Bait, you will recognise a number of stylistic features shared with that film, such as grainy, gritty, 16mm photography, sometimes unflattering close-ups of people's faces, interesting spare sound design. The main difference between the two, there are two main differences. One is in terms of generic classification. I suppose you would describe Bait as a community drama, whereas Enys Men is perhaps in the folk horror genre, but I put an emphasis on the word perhaps, and this is going to be a conversation which is very much in the horror adjacent category that we occasionally have on this podcast, I think. The storyline in Enys Men which also might be described as an art film or an experimental film. The storyline is very. I don't want to use the word thin because that's a pejorative, but it's not simple, but it's trying to find an appropriate word for the storyline in Bait. Just let it is existent. That's what I will choose. It just about exists. It's about a volunteer researcher living a lonely life, doing botanical studies on an island of which she seems to be the only occupant. Although, as she studies the lichen on the flowers that grow on the cliff edge, she is beset by what may be visions or memories. She seems to have somebody else living with her, but then she doesn't. She receives distress calls, maydays from the sinking of a lifeboat in the past, and it's a sinking that occurred, I think, before the invention of the radio, so that's quite a striking element. She sees herself as other people, such as the rescuers of a character killed in a boating accident, and I'm not sure what it all means, but it's certainly an intriguing watch. Oh, and I don't think I mentioned the other difference between this and Bait. It is simply that Bait is in very striking black and white photography. Enys Men is in colour, and it's set in the 1970s, and it does kind of look like a movie of that era. It's in fact set in 1973, which put me immediately in mind. Kirsty will be extremely unsurprised to note of my favourite movie, The Wicker Man. But later in the movie, I realised there's another major horror movie from 1973 that may be being referenced here, Don't Look Now, with the prominence of a red-coated figure kind of appearing and disappearing, and also a narrative in which you are not really sure what's real and not at any one point. I would say that, listener, if you haven't seen the movie, we're going to talk about it in what could be termed a spoiler-ish fashion, but also I don't know if this is a movie that can be really spoiled. I'm not really sure that there is anything solid in it, that it cannot be put down to the interpretation of the viewer. Kirsty, I'll hand the discussion over to you. What's your first thought about Enys Men?
My first, I think I need to preface it by saying I hadn't seen Bait, so I was kind of aware of Jenkin, and I was aware of Bait, but had not seen it. So, but I think I was drawn to this because there seemed to be quite a lot of sort of discussion in that, kind of in the kind of cinephilic communities, but particularly the kind of more experimental art film kind of groups and stuff that I'm kind of part of, I'm aware of, and I'm a sucker, as you well know, for weird arty stuff.
Yes,
So
absolutely.
I've been meaning to see it for ages actually. And when I was at the BFI, was it last year? Yeah, that there's kind of lots of stuff in the shop there, and lots of kind of emphasis on it as this kind of almost iconic film, which always felt weird because it's not that old.
Mm,
So that intrigued me more. And again, I hadn't really thought about the connection to Don't Look Now, but the poster is just this very singular figure in the red jacket, which is
right, yeah.
also obviously does have connections now I think about it. And yeah, so I noticed it was on the Channel 4 streaming service. And so I thought, right, okay, this is an opportunity to sort of sit down and watch it. I will confess that sometimes when I'm drawing, I kind of just like to have something on the background, and usually something
Right.
atmospheric. So I put it on while I was sort of sketching and doing some stuff a couple of weeks ago, and I knew that it had this, kind of reputation for it being experimental folk horror. So I just thought this is probably a really good film for me. I absolutely sort of take what you were saying about the does it have a plot? But again, most experimental films don't. They kind of challenge
No.
that narrative. But what I found interesting about it was that I spent, as I suppose a lot of people do when you watch anything that is sort of on that more non-narrative edge of cinema, is desperately trying to figure out what the relationships were between kind of, there's you talked about there's lots of emphasis on the radio that kind of
Yes.
comes into her, and then the kind of these sort of this seem very sort of dislocated kind of occurrences on the island with her, but involving other people. And you do,
Mm.
and so you think, oh, she's on her own, and then suddenly there's her daughter, maybe it's her daughter, I'm not sure, is suddenly there, and then there's this man, and I don't know who he is, and then there's other groups of people, and they seem to be from
Mm.
another time, and and I think what I really enjoyed was just that being bombarded with stuff that I had no clue about what was going on, but I really loved the way that it looked, and I loved the process of kind of trying to figure it out, trying to find some sort of relatively conventional narrative meaning in something that's clearly not meant to have that. But I liked very much the sort of sense that I started to get the sense that maybe, is she also a ghost? Are these all ghosts on this island and she's just not
Mm.
aware that she is yet? Um, and for me, that was maybe the most kind of useful sort of trajectory through it. Um, but I loved, so, as you said, it's kind of shot on 16 mil, so that 4:3 aspect ratio. It did really remind me of the kind of the feel of, even though it doesn't look like it massively, I don't think, but the feel of it just in terms of the kind of pacing and maybe the use of sound and the emphasis on maybe slightly more understated performances. It reminded me a little bit of Stone Tape.
Oh yes. Yeah.
Yeah, it just kind of had, I don't know, it was if it was just because it was that emphasis on the kind of female experience and just the sort of being completely, at odds with with her environment.
Mm.
Um, yeah, so I really enjoyed that. And you'll notice we're saying she because the protagonist isn't named. She's not given. We don't know what.
Yeah.
She's clearly doing botanical studies, as you said. She's gonna. We keep going back to the this log that she's got the dates, and
Yeah.
then just whatever she's looking at, and then it just says no change, no change, no change, no change, and it does sort of create that sense that she's sort of stuck in this loop. She's which I think potentially feeds into this idea that maybe she is stuck there. And it also made me think of there's that short there's a novella called um I want to say the island dropped Moreau, but that's not it. It's the it's it's fallen out of my head now. Of
It's not
Morel,
dark
the invention.
matter, is it?
No, the
No.
invention of Morel. That's what it's called.
Oh, okay.
By again, I can't remember authors tonight for some reason. That's about a man who finds himself on an island. And there's something weird happening in the island. There is more plot to that one. But again, it's just that it's a story of an island, and somebody sort of finding themselves with weird things happening around them and not quite understanding why, and not having the means to actually make sense of it either. So it's not like, oh, there's a mystery and, oh well, if I keep looking and digging I'll find the answer. There is just isn't an answer. um yeah, so I I thoroughly enjoyed watching it. I was thoroughly confused by it,
Right.
but enchanted by it. And I like and again, this is probably the only spoilery bit, is I absolutely adored the ending. So one of the things that our protagonist is sort of drawn to is that there's this kind of ancient it looks like it's an ancient standing stone on the island that she's sort of drawn to. At the
Oh
beginning of the
yes.
film, there's a bit of a radio broadcast which talks about a monument that's a monument to all those who've been lost around the
Yes.
island. So you spend a lot of time thinking that's what the monument is. That's what this stone is. It's that monument. But it seems to have this very sort of looming quality in the film. And it seems to move as well, not move physically, but move its location.
Mm.
And then there's this just beautiful reveal at the end where she's losing it. And or not when she's losing it. No, actually, I think it's the reverse of that. I think when she's sort of coming to an awareness of actually what's happening to her, where it's almost suggested through the editing that she is the stone,
Yes.
which I just thought was really beautiful, a way of kind of, reconciling her, with the island, in that she seemed to spend a lot of time being on the island, not with the island. And by the
Mm.
end, it felt like she was, kind of part of it.
Well,
Um,
again, the symbolism of the red coat seems to
yes.
make her. It makes her stand out from the
Yeah.
island, and there are
Yeah.
lots of very long shots of her on the cliff, and you can
Yeah.
make her out clearly.
Yeah.
That's a regular motif of the film, isn't it?
Mm.
What were you going to
And
say, Kirsty?
no, I was going to say one of the things that I love about with these films is, and I think it's the kind of gift of our, or it's a gift or an advantage of our digital age, is that you can watch a film that confuses you, and kind of almost immediately kind of go to the internet and go, internet, tell me what it means, and then because when you do that, you never
Yeah,
get like a singular response. You get lots of people different interpretations of what the
yeah.
film's about, which I love. And maybe it's, kind of a little bit of being neurodivergent. I do like to know what other people think, so I try and figure
Yes,
it out
it
myself.
helps you work out what you
Yeah.
think. I
Um,
understand that.
yeah, and so I kind of quite a lot about its, the kind of structure of the film is deliberately non-narrative because part of it is about trauma and memory.
Mm,
The idea of, and I think in some ways that the idea of memory helps with the way that it looks like it's, like it's physical. It looks like analog film from, an
mm,
era, from a long time ago. Um, and I love as well this sort of sense of the way that the land, there's quite a lot of on the kind of the island as a character in the film,
yes.
and the idea of the commentary on changing environments and kind of human encroachment on natural spaces. And with my kind of pagan head on, I also kind of sort of see that as being about the kind of the spirits of the land, kind of manifesting in different ways and sort of challenging the human encroachment on it, or ultimately with the stone sort of taking the human influence and making it more natural. Um,
Okay.
yeah, so it looks amazing. It's got lots of bonkers things going on. Um, and I still don't quite know what it means, but I like that it leans into that. On the one hand, it looks sort of, kind of fairly, yeah, almost like, yeah, 1970s television. So I think
Mm,
you kind of, you look at it and you go, oh, I'm meant to understand this is real. And then there are points where it sort of jumps off the deep end and we kind of end up with sort of surreal juxtapositions, particularly like there's, a sequence with the kind of dancing girls
right.
as they're kind of, and these kind of, groups of characters that are clearly sort of out of time on the island, or maybe they're in, I don't know,
Well,
so
that's part of the question, isn't it? Who's
yeah,
out of time and in time, and what
yeah,
is time?
yeah,
And I think your reading of the ending is very reasonable. That it seems like maybe she's a ghost. It reminds me of the themes of more conventional horror narratives like The Shining and like where in The Shining, I think the in the film at least, the ultimate conclusion is you've always been here. And it also reminds me of a converse thing which in The Haunting or The Haunting of Hill House, but certainly in the 1963 film. I still haven't read the Shirley Jackson novel, but Eleanor's ultimate realization that she belongs in the house. So she may have come from elsewhere, but she's staying there once she gets there, and time ceases to mean anything.
Yeah.
So this movie kind of could be considered a re-articulation of those themes in the within the aesthetic that Jenkin is developing, which is based on, I think we should mention in case the listener is not familiar with either of Jenkin's films, I believe he shoots on 16mm films, so he's presumably using the kind of clockwork cameras that we used when we were studying film 20-something years ago.
Yeah.
And I think he records sound in a similar way, similarly archaic way. At least that's what the impression I got from watching the movie, is that the sound was probably not recorded live. It's probably everything was dubbed. Because the soundtrack seems very sparse and careful, in a way which kind of highlights the artificial nature of it. Like Mary Woodvine, who plays the main character, who I think is credited as the volunteer, as you say, she doesn't have a name. I found it jarring every time she spoke, because I felt like her voice didn't sound like her face suggested she should sound, and because there is so little dialogue in the movie, you don't have time to get used to her voice. So it was jarring every time, and I couldn't work out if that was just because that's the way her voice is, or whether that jarringness was heightened by the fact that everything was post-dubbed and didn't, seemed the sounds seemed kind of separate from the visuals all the time.
It's interesting actually, because and obviously it's been a while, but when we talked about film nightmares, I may or may not have mentioned Louis Buñuel's L'Age d'Or.
I think you did mention it. Yes.
So when he uses a similar technique actually in that film, which is to use sound in a way that it's clearly not worldized, and so it's a kind of it's becomes like an alienation device, because you're just so aware that it doesn't quite fit. I'm not sure Jenkin means to sort of go quite that far here, but there's certainly something unsettling, and uncanny is probably a really good word actually to describe the way that sound is used. It's real enough to you go, oh yeah, that's kind of that's real sound of whatever, but it's just sort of not rooted in the visual enough for it to feel like it's completely synchronous. And so I think that has it, it's a subtle but affecting technique to just sort of create that strangeness that I think he does so well.
Yes.
I was thinking actually when you were talking that, well, a couple of things. One is that, obviously this idea of folk horror, and I think we think about it as being folk horror because it's rural location, and it's and we also got quite a lot of daytime shooting as well.
Yes, and it has elements which suggest things like tradition. A particular communal kind of behaviour. I mean, this movie leaves a lot of that open to interpretation, but it is in there. And also the relationship between humanity and the land.
Which is what I was going to say. Is I think this is probably, if you're going to describe it as horror of any kind, I think there's enough there to say that it is, even though it's more psychological. I think it's more eco horror than it is folk horror because of that emphasis on the land.
Yeah.
And also,
there's a touch of body horror in it that because the lichen starts to grow on her, and that element is not explained in any straightforward way, and it maybe doesn't go far enough for a body horror fan to be satisfied by what happens, but it is an element in the mix.
Yeah, and particularly if we go back to that idea that she sort of becomes sort of consumed by the island or part of the island.
Mm.
And the stone has the lichen on it as well. So it's like, we kind of keep going
Yes,
back to
yeah.
this scar that she has, and there's more and more lichen on it as the film progresses. But I really liked as well this idea of one of the things that, kind of happens in shamanic practice is, the idea of being, doing nature connection, spending time in nature. And, the idea of sort of, you know, solitary practice and being out in nature as being really important for sort of spiritual development.
Mm.
Um, and so that sort of sense that if she's completely on her own except for when it appears that she's not, but we don't know, Jenkins doesn't give us enough to know that this is definitely somebody who's actually
No.
there rather than a memory or a vision, or in some cases just other energies or spirits that are existing in the same place but she doesn't even kind
Mm.
of recognize them. And that idea of, the kind of either it's fodder for, again, psychological thriller or horror of, that, solitary, um, kind of, yeah, experience as the thing that drives you mad. But actually, it also equally could be a thing that brings you closer to those forces that are, kind of that we need to be more in tune with. And so I'm not sure the ending, which for kind of somebody expecting a conventional ending from this film might be like, oh my God, she's been completely turned into the stone and that's horrific. But
Mm.
I find it more reassuring actually that, somehow
Okay.
she transcends those,
Yeah.
concerns or that confrontation of trauma and sort of somehow, kind of reconciles herself with the peace of that space and those spirits.
Yes, I think that's a fair interpretation of the ending. Can we just have a bit of a chat about interpretations of various elements?
Yep.
I'm going to try and avoid giving away the ultimate ending of the movie because you've avoided that, and it is quite a powerful,
Yeah.
effective thing. So I don't want to spoil that either.
No.
But I will talk about the character she seems to live with, who you mentioned
Mm-hmm.
might be her daughter.
Hmm.
So when she started to appear, that was my immediate um, reading. She's the right age to be the daughter of
Hmm.
this woman.
Mm-hmm.
And they seem to talk to each other. But then later on, we see a sequence where the daughter character has an accident,
Mm-hmm.
and she falls onto a rock and is scarred, and the location of the scar is the same spot that the volunteer has a scar, which is where the lichen
Yeah.
begins to grow. So I thought, oh,
Yeah.
it's her younger self. And if it
Yeah.
is, um, and she actually had an accident on the island, which is obviously where we see it happen because we don't see
Mm.
anything outside the
No.
island in the movie. That suggests she has been there a long time.
Mm.
Um, that was, I mean, that doesn't make sense of a lot of other elements, but that was the way I kind of read that progression of that strand of the movie. How
Yeah.
do you feel about that?
Yeah. I know. I sort of thought sort of similarly about it. It's, there's a kind of, yeah, because the film itself is so dreamlike, and
Mm,
it's sort of dreamlike and rational at the same time. And I think that's the thing that's confusing about it is that the aesthetic of it feels, almost sort of in some ways documentary like because of that,
mm,
grainy. But I don't know. I think there's something in there about trauma, isn't there? Um,
very
and
much
that
so,
kind
yes.
of, yeah, layering of trauma and that reconciling of trauma, and the acceptance of trauma as well, I think. Um, Even though like in the sequence that you're talking about, we don't really understand why she, we see the accident itself, but we don't really understand exactly what leads up to it.
Mm.
because of the way that he depicts it. So I think it is meant to be, kind of more symbolic of maybe a kind of an acceptance of or moving past. Um, I like the idea as well of the sort of the sense of that if we accept that she is the younger version is her, or the younger actress is the version
Mm.
of the protagonist, is that sort of sense of yeah, growth and change. And there's something I think as well, the fact she's sort of looking at, the flowers, and she seems to be you know that there's these flowers that I'm going to be honest, don't I didn't particularly buy as being like natural flowers in that particular place,
Right.
but
No.
anyway, of that sort of sense of kind of almost want looking for change externally and not finding it until you're able to kind of make change internally. So again,
Yeah.
yeah, so there's sort of like ideas of development and growth and acceptance, and that way that there's, in a very oblique way, a discussion about the kind of ecological, kind of layering, and the, human layering, and, the kind of development
Yes.
of experience and trauma and change. And the way that we, our bodies change over time, the way that nature changes over time, and it transforms and it decays and it is damaged, and it's and I was really struck as well. So there's a, she keeps going back to this, what appears to be a mine shaft, doesn't she,
Yes. Yes.
and dropping this stone. It becomes this repeated action, like for some reason she's expecting something different to happen every time she drops the stone. And
Mm.
we only just about register, don't we, on the in the sound, that
Yes. Yes.
final kind of sound of it hitting water somewhere
Yeah.
deep
Yeah.
in the island. And the way that I spent quite a long time thinking about that, about, is this, your kind of genre brain goes, oh, is there something gonna come out of there and it's gonna be all horrible? But, nothing really does kind of come from that, except to remind us how deep the kind of structure of the island is. And so,
Mm.
you maybe think about the kind of geology of that, over years and layers, and, the shifts and
Mm.
the change and the weather-beaten land, and one of the most stunning, and I'd love to know how they did it as well, the most stunning sort of transitions in the film, because it seems such a lo-fi film, but deliberately so, where you've got the kind of exterior of the house that she stays in, the cottage, where we've in one version of it, it's clearly habitable and the windows are there and everything seems kind of well kept. But then we get later, you know almost as if it's vision, this kind of, the same house, but everything is overgrown and the windows are in and kind of nature's reclaimed it. um
Yeah. Yeah.
Sort of seeing kind of like the echoes between those two things, I think, is I find quite interesting.
Yes. I think the repeated invoking of mining imagery through the movie. Obviously, there is
Mm,
an actual mine shaft. It seems to be a
yeah,
mine shaft on the island, but also we go into it and there are visions or ghosts or whatever it is of miners in there,
yeah,
and that furthers the theme of um, nature versus humanity and the way they literally one can be undermined by the other and the relationship between them.
undermined, what a pun.
Yes, exactly. So, yes, forgive me. Please forgive me.
No.
And yeah, there's a huge amount to think about in this movie.
Mm.
And like you, I still don't feel that I've got a really solid read on it. I would like to watch it again at some point. I'd rather watch this again than watch Bait again. I tell you what, I really would like the most though, and this might seem a slightly disparaging comment, but I would like Jenkin to make a movie that was more conventional in narrative, but stuck
Mm.
to his aesthetic and technical choices, because I loved the evocation of the period,
Mm.
which was not really about much other than a couple of costume choices and the fact that it's actually filmed in that way. Um,
Yeah.
and um, I kind of found myself missing stuff like that. But that I'm a junkie for that kind of 70s British cinema stuff, so I was bound to
Mm.
like it on that level. Um,
Yeah.
um, I think it's worth mentioning because we are a horror podcast. One thing that I was pleased and surprised about was that John Woodvine is in this movie, who plays Dr. Hirsch in An American Werewolf in London. And he's the father of Mary Woodvine, who plays the volunteer, but he
Yes.
does he
Yeah.
does appear, and I think I thought he'd passed away, so I didn't think it
Mm.
was him, but I did think, oh, that actor really looks like John Woodvine, but no, it is him.
It is.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and so that was nice.
When you were talking about before about wanting to see it again, I feel like this is a film I could watch 20 times and come away with 20 different interpretations of it and see different things in it. And I just, kind of was thinking about what other films sort of do something similar, um, in terms of its technique and its theme. And actually, I think maybe Ben Wheatley's A Field in England might
Okay.
have that might be an interesting sort of companion to this film. I mean, obviously that film is a lot more
That's
bombastic and a lot more crazy, but there
yeah.
are sort of, that sort of interplay between the landscape and humanity, and the way in which those, affect each other, which, kind of can is represented in both films through sort of cinematic technique, which,
Yes,
might be
I'd
interesting. It
agree
makes me
there.
think, oh, I might go and back and watch that because I've not seen that one for a while. But
Yeah, I've not seen a field in England since it was new, which is 10 years ago, 2013, I think it came out.
wow,
11
wow,
years ago. Um,
okay,
but there are many kind of thematic things about the two films that go together, and
mm,
even narratively, even though narrative is not something which we talked about being primal in Enys Men, um, but just the fact that it's a small number of characters and a relatively small area of land that
mm,
and the movie take I mean A Field in England, that's the title of the movie. It is
yeah,
about the field. You never go beyond the field, as I
no,
remember, except maybe in some kind of flashbacks, very quick like battle
mm,
montages. I'm not, although maybe they take place on the same field, I'm not sure.
very probably,
Pretty sure they were filmed on the same field, but they're meant to be. Who knows? But yeah. Um, the other thing I think it's probably worth saying about this movie is that it was made during COVID.
mm,
So they must have had all kinds of restrictions on what they could do, and I wonder if
yeah,
that actually played into the conception of the movie. Like that, this
yeah.
is maybe what you would do if you had to make a movie in COVID. Um, a single character in an isolated location,
Yeah,
not
yeah, who's played
interacting.
by an actress married to the director. That's also handy, I think.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay, right, right.
So I think that definitely kind of helps, and I think it's like it's not obviously a favorite thing to do to sort of spend time remembering that particular era of our lives, but this is what artists of all stripes do, isn't it? In times of crisis, is you find ways to be inventive and to work around the restrictions that you have, and often
Yes,
that kind of gives rise to works that wouldn't have existed otherwise. And I really like the sparsity of this. I like the simplicity of it, and I actually as well discovered, also I was just sort of prepping for this, is that one of the kind of ethos of the film was to try and make it as low carbon as possible, to make it as environmentally
oh yes, yes.
friendly as possible. And so like the sort of discussion that the film it encourages around that kind of relationship between humanity and the land and respecting the land, um is, I think, was kind of reflected behind the camera as well, which, you know, most films don't give a crap about, do they? Most film productions don't really
Yes.
care. So that was, something that I thought that's really nice that they've done that as well. I think it's a
Yes,
singular film.
it is. Thematically, we should mention as well that it's not. Uh, it doesn't use Cornish as its main language. The title is in Cornish though, and a lot of the songs sung are traditional Cornish
Yeah,
language songs, and they did things like having a poster in Cornish and things like that.
yeah,
Um, so the idea of tradition and a respect for um, not just the land, but also the kind of the history of the people of the land
yeah.
and the things which kind of steep into the land in terms of memories that resonate and things. That's also part of this movie very much.
And actually, maybe there's something there in this idea that, in folk horror, more often than not, the folk traditions that are being represented are about kind of going, oh, look at those backward people, with their, kind of old-fashioned rituals and ideas that ultimately, leads to the kind of horror. Whereas this
Mm.
feels, it doesn't emphasize that as much, but it feels quite respectful and honoring of
Yes.
of that place and those traditions and those people. So yeah, not folk horror. I'm gonna I'm gonna come down on one side and go, this is not folk horror. It looks like, and it might, be by some people be misconstrued as that, but I don't think it is.
Well, maybe we could call it folk, not horror.
Not horror.
Because I don't think it is too horrific, really, and
No.
I think your positive reading of it is very persuasive.
Hmm.
It's a positive take on those themes, and and through things like Jenkins' own atonal musical score, it does play on those kind of frisons of disquiet that
Hmm.
folk horror and horror in general does. But
Yeah.
but ultimately, your interpretation of it as a viewer is left to you, and I think it is quite feasible to interpret it in a very positive way. Um, and I love your interpretation of this movie. That brings us to the end of our time for this episode of the podcast. So, dear listener, if you haven't already, go watch Enys Men, and please do comment if you have ideas or interpretations or theories about the movie. We would really appreciate that. Kirsty, thank you for your time and for suggesting this movie, which has been very fruitful, and I think we could talk about it for a lot longer.
Hmm. Well, thank you, Dan.
You're very welcome, Kirsty. It's my pleasure, absolutely. And maybe we will come back to this subject with a comparable companion film, whether it be A Field in England or something else. That was a good shout as
Mm.
well. So, dear listener, the next episode that we'll be releasing is a discussion about nightmares on film between myself and Kirsty. So you'll be hearing that in our next episode, unless you're a Patreon supporter, in which case you can go to our Patreon page where that episode will be available to you right now. In the meantime, as they say at the end of podcasts for some reason, I've been Dan, as if I was somebody else earlier or about to become someone else.
Maybe you're about to become a big stone.
Well, that's quite possible. I'm going back to the land. Yes,
Yes.
one day, Kirsty, one day. Thank you so much, Kirsty. Thank you so much, dear listener, and you will hear from us again. Bye bye.
Bye.
You have been listening to And Now the Podcast Starts, an Ambisol podcast. Presented by Kirsty Warrow and T.D. Velasquez. Special thanks to Greg Hume for our original theme music. Our original artwork is by Kirsty Warrow. Please search One Crow Left on Instagram, Etsy, or Redbubble to see and purchase more of Kirsty's work. All clips from films, TV shows, trailers, and musical works are used for the purposes of criticism in the spirit of fair use as defined in the US law and fair dealing as defined in the laws of Commonwealth nations. No copyright infringement is intended. Please visit our home on the web, andnowpodcast.com, for more content and contact details. You can follow us on Mastodon, Blue Sky, and even Twitter, which we refuse to call X, it's an insult, X the unknown. Our handle for each is @andnowpodcast. Meanwhile, Threads and Instagram users need simply search @andnowpodcast. On Facebook, search @andnowpod. If you'd like to donate to help us with the costs of making the podcast, please visit patreon.com/andnowpodcast. Donors get early access to upcoming content and other exclusives. This podcast was produced and released by Ambidextrous Solutions Limited. And now the podcast stops.